the biggest thing is to know what your priorities are. I think is probably one of the most important things. Um, it's often easy to rationalize and to justify staying like working. It's like if I'm not working, then I'm not I'm not moving things forward. But there's another quote, something like, there's nothing more wasteful than working on something that should not have existed to begin with. And so, like, a lot of time, you can spend 5 or 6 hours working on a thing, but if you just spent 1 hour thinking about what you should actually be doing, you might not have had to spend that 5 hours on something that was completely wasteful. So my background's in software development, and so a lot of my personal biases come from software development. Um, I I think that one of the main, probably the most important word when thinking about resource management is the word constraints. And uh, you have to know what your constraints are and ruthlessly eliminate those constraints. And so, in almost every software company, it is engineering time that is the constraint of progress for the company. Um, so, figuring out anything that you can do to maximize the value of engineering time should really be the number one priority. Um, so, uh, the there are a lot of good books on this. One is called The Goal, which is a classic on the topic of resource management. Um, Another that's specifically focused on software companies is the Phoenix Project, which is another one that I would highly recommend. I recommend reading a lot of books. I try to read at least 2 books a week, and that's really where a lot of the learnings and value comes from. I think that there's a there's a quote that I like. I think it's in one of the articles that I posted, but a quote from Bismarck where he says that any fool can learn from experience. The wise man learns from others' experience. And I think that really speaks a lot to how one should think about these problems. And sometimes the only way you can learn it is by learning it the hard way. Like at my second company, Sightline Maps, which didn't really go anywhere, um, I had read about sales cycles and why they make it hard to run companies when you have really long sales cycles. But it really wasn't until I experienced the the pot of gold that was at the end of the rainbow that always felt like it was a couple weeks away, and it felt like that for 2 years. Uh, Really made it hard to plan and to build a company around that. So the more you can learn from books and from other people's experience, the better. So I think one of the most important things to think about as it relates to, I think there's probably 2 ways to go about it. One is like the personal side, and one's the company side. Um, I think that on the work side, probably the most important thing to avoid is bike shedding, which is it's a term that's pretty well known in the programming world. I'll post it in the I'll post it in the chat here. It's also known as the law of triviality. There's a famous story. Um, the the simplified version is somebody was looking at the transcripts of a city council meeting of a town that was thinking about building a nuclear power plant, which is a very big decision in this town. And looking through the transcripts, uh, what he expected to see was a lot of debate about should we build a nuclear power plant in our town. And what he found is that they spent almost the entire conversation talking about what color the bike shed should be and how many bikes it should hold. Because the hard question of like, should we build a nuclear power plant? Nobody really knew what to do, but everyone has a preference on what color the bike shed should be. So it's like, well, I think it should be blue. Well, no, I think green's a better color, because everyone can argue at that level. So the entire conversation just got stuck in arguing about that. And that's something that there's another saying that most startups die of indigestion, not murder. And this really comes from a bad resource management when there is some really hard problem that you need to solve, but it's easy to just find, well, instead of doing that, we'll just spend a couple weeks on this quick win that's going to be easier. And next thing you know, it's a year later, you still haven't solved the hard problem, which is the whole point of doing this. And instead, you've just been polishing things that really shouldn't have even built to begin with. So um, I'll kind of leave it there and jump into the questions if that sounds like the right format. Does that work?
That works perfect. So like we quickly explain, we have a light beam link.
Yep.
So everybody you can go up and share your questions and upvote. This first one, I actually think I know who asked. And I'm gonna call her out just so she can ask the question live. Laddie, do you want to come up and ask your question?
Yes. Um, Hi, Sam. So based on the content that you share on Level Podcast, which by the way, I love, but
Mhm.
you seem very thoughtful about your time. So the question is, how do you allocate your priorities and manages your time as CEO?
Yeah. I think you have to be you have to be mindful of how you spend your time. That is the constraint as a CEO. I think the biggest one is to try to solve problems at a systems level more than anything. Um, so the I think the most important thing when considering time, for me at least, this is maybe just a personality thing, but I've found that I'm extremely sensitive to context switching. So uh, if I'm jumping from task to task, I'm not going to get anything done the whole day. Like yesterday, I had no calls or meetings the whole day, and I just wrote several memos and thought about a number of important company organizational design things. Today, it's basically just only meetings because I'm happy to just jump from meeting to meeting, but going from one idea to another and jumping back and forth, uh, it is funny. I meet a lot of people who think that they're good at multitasking. They'll even describe it as like a skill set that they have. And I can tell you empirically, every study that has been done on this topic shows that nobody can multitask. It is not a thing that exists. You should not try to do it. So, um, trying to keep the main thing. Somebody said that at some point. I think that might have, I always, it's probably Paul Graham, sort of the oracle of these kinds of quotes. The Uh, I regularly, because I proactively budget my calendar, I'll often look at it probably about once a month. I'll look at what I'm scheduled to do and I'll ask myself, is this, if I don't do these things, will it kill the company? And oftentimes the answer is no. In fact, usually the answer is no. And then I just start canceling things and I'll just completely redo my calendar. So uh, I think really things, this is not an easy thing, but it can, things always feel urgent in the moment. And part of being the CEO is to be able to insulate yourself from the seemingly urgent things that are actually not that important. So, this isn't an easy thing to do. I would suggest like meditation, probably therapy. I don't know, but something to just get to a point where when somebody comes to you with something that feels like a crisis, it's really your responsibility to not panic and to be able to weigh the trade offs. And most of the time, I can tell you when we have had things that seem like a crisis, you can just say, I don't know, let this one go. We'll have this will just be a small failure and we can move on. It's not worth dedicating the resources to fix it. And that can be really painful for some people. It's a failure mode that I've seen in a lot of startups, especially with first time founders, where they they expect the failure rate to be zero, and they're afraid to launch. They uh, they want to make sure that if one customer has a bad experience, that they like redo their entire process to make sure that nobody else has a bad experience. But that's just not realistic. And there's a good first round piece by Rahul from Superhuman on finding product market fit, which if you haven't read it, it's definitely worth a read, where he basically says almost everybody tries to find their worst customers, the people who complain about it, who are like a one NPS, and they try to convert them into into tens. And what you really should do is you should fire everyone who is not, you should fire everyone who's not a 9 or 10 and just lean into those 9s and 10s and make a product that's even better for them. Find more of those people, fire your worst customers, and keep moving forward. So most people spend all of their time probably from like a sense of self-worth. It's like probably deep from like childhood traumas or something, but trying to convert the people who don't like their product when really you should be focusing on your advocates. So I think circling back to the original question of how to manage time as a CEO, I think the biggest thing is to know what your priorities are. I think is probably one of the most important things. It's often easy to rationalize and to justify staying like working. It's like, if I'm not working, then I'm not I'm not moving things forward. But there's another quote, something like, there's nothing more wasteful than working on something that should not have existed to begin with. And so like a lot of time you can spend 5 or 6 hours working on a thing, but if you just spent 1 hour thinking about what you should actually be doing, you might not have had to spend that 5 hours on something that was completely wasteful. So I actually do a think week. I do a think week once a quarter. I take an entire week off. I'm actually in the last day of my think week right now for this quarter. I take an entire week off of work. I don't do phone calls. I don't do meetings. I don't do anything for the entire week. I just do writing. I just think about what's important. I wrote yesterday, I spent half of yesterday writing out a pre-mortem document, which is a narrative style of each section starts with the levels died today. And then you just think about a reason why the company died and you write it out very specifically. Like we died because our product velocity stalled. We weren't able to solve these big problems. Eventually, other people joined the market and they caught up to us, and we've just been stuck in a situation. And then thinking about ways to mitigate those risks. So I think there were 6 scenarios that I came up with in this pre-mortem of like likely failure cases of the company. So that's something that I found is extremely helpful. Anybody who's seen we have a lot of memos internally, and it's not a coincidence. I've probably written 3/4 of them internally at this point, just because we're still quite small. We're only about 40 people, but they tend to be written in clusters. Like we had, I don't know, a dozen memos written in June of 2020, which was during my think week in June. And so they tend to cluster around these weeks where I have a lot of time to just really think about what's important for the company. So I'd say knowing what your priorities are and keeping them the number one priority. And as it ties into bike shedding as well, there's no easy way to know. Maybe asking people on your team to hold you accountable to this, but it's really easy to get distracted. Doing the hard thing is hard, and that's why most people don't do it. And most companies fail, and that's not fun. I advise a number of startups. One of them is on the tail end of failing, and he's having a really hard time accepting that. And I can tell you, having been on the other side of it, it's not that bad, but it's really hard to know that until you're on the other side of it. So, really knowing what your priorities are and holding yourself accountable to solving those really important problems is probably the most important thing as it relates to time management.
Thanks, Sam. And actually, the next question is very aligned with a little bit of feeling is, what has been your most expensive and important lesson as a CEO so far?
I'd have to think about it. I can think of a lot of other lessons at previous companies as well. this is my first non-technical role as CEO. I've usually been lead engineer, CTO. Um, some of the most expensive lessons, this is a really stupid one, but at Sightline Maps, we didn't know what we were doing. It was our first time raising money, and we timed our fundraising around when we would run out of money, which makes sense. Like, why would you raise money when you have money? You raise money when you don't have money because that's when you need money. Um, turns out that was a mistake, because turns out when you don't have money, nobody wants to give you any money because they think you're about to run out of money. So realizing that cash is an asset, and that you need to start your fundraising process, like people often say 18 months or 12 months before you're out of cash, because you need to make sure, and this was, we talked to, I think it was the founder of Instacart, said that you should raise money when you have momentum, not when you need money. And I think that's very true. It can be hard to justify. Like, I had to write a memo on this to the team, like why we raised more money when we did, because we didn't need it. Like, we currently have 40 months of runway, and we just closed our Series A, which I think is officially closing in like a couple weeks. But we don't need the money right now, but we have a lot of momentum. So now is the time to do it, not when we're running out of money. So I would say another really expensive lesson was from Cardash, which was around understanding your growth channels. That was a painful lesson where we went through Y Combinator. We started scaling very quickly. We went from like no revenue to $1 million in revenue in just a few months while we were in YC. And we didn't really know why. And we would ask our customers, how did you find out about Cardash? Like, how did you find out about the service? And they would say, oh, well, a friend told me. And we told ourselves, like, hey, this is organic growth. This is what you want, right? This is a sign that it's working. And then we hired a lot of people, and then growth stalled. And we didn't know why. We didn't know why because we didn't know how it got there to begin with. And we'd really overhired, assuming that this growth curve would continue. And we didn't know what levers to pull because we didn't even know what levers there were to begin with. So we've been much more intentional and methodical at Levels about building a lot of long tail inbound. So focusing on, in our case, content, working with creators, things that just have this long tail effect where you can be much more predictable and consistent about inbound. So that was a hard lesson of making sure that you have a sales cycle that you understand and you can repeat. I think some of the biggest lessons at Levels would be what? What's been the most expensive lesson so far? I don't know. There have been so many hard lessons learned at other companies that I have not repeated most of them, which is good. Let's see. I think that some of the things that were mistakes in previous companies that we have not made this mistake at Levels is we invest a lot of company resourcing into recruiting, and recruiting for some people means hiring a recruiter and paying $80,000 for an executive hire. And I just don't think that's a good use of resources. I think that coming up with Ben, who's our head of growth, often uses the term a pull product, where instead of you like pushing ads on people, people come to you. And there's a term in network theory called preferential attachment, which is a similar concept around making something where people want to be associated. And so instead of putting that $80,000 of recruiting fees towards hiring Riviera or some of these recruiting firms, instead put it into content, we have a full-time multimedia producer in-house who just creates content for everything. And we have a company podcast. We have a YouTube channel. We just make content for everything. And we're just really transparent about how we operate. And that has really paid dividends in recruiting. I think of our last 20 hires, I think 18 of them specifically mentioned the podcast and all of the content we put out as one of the main reasons that they wanted to join. Because it really is a leap of faith that people are taking when you join a company. And if you don't know who the people are, if you don't know how they operate, it really can be stressful to make that decision. But what most people who join Levels say is they've watched the Friday forums for so long, they already feel like they know everyone on the team. And so when they start, it's just like being on the other side of the television. It's not a big change from what they were anticipating. So that was a I'll say that is the most expensive mistake I've made in the past. It is not investing in talent and team. Um, this is a mistake that we have not made here, but I have made in the past. Is don't be afraid to hire senior. This is a thing that people often talk about. Is they're like, yeah, this person's really great, but they're too senior for the role. I found that if you set the expectations very clearly of, on paper, you're probably too senior for this role because you're going to have to be in the weeds doing these things. Are you okay with that? And if they say yes, then they're opting in to also doing the grunt work for some period of time before building out their team. We had this conversation. Josh Moorer, who joined us to lead global operations for us, he was the general manager of Uber New York, and he scaled Uber New York to like what it is now. And he said that he wanted to join, which was a surprise to all of us. And the pushback from internally was like, he's too senior for this role. We don't need somebody of this caliber right now. And I said, no, absolutely. If he wants to join our company, we should hire him immediately. And it doesn't matter what he costs. Just get the best people on board. And so don't be too cheap in hiring. It kind of depends on what it is you're doing. We're not in an industry where I Flix has this concept of talent density. It's worth reading the book No Rules Rules if you haven't already. It's about Netflix culture. And the concept of talent density is it makes a lot of sense when you think about the math behind communication pathways, which is that the number of people at your company scales linearly, but the number of communication pathways between people scales polynomially. So if you have 3 people, there's a communication pathway between 2 people. Once you get to like 20 people, even 50 people, once you get to 50 people, there's like 1,000 communication pathways. So communication and overhead becomes much, much more expensive with large organizations. So if you can keep the team smaller and higher caliber, it's adding one person necessarily adds less than 1 unit of capacity because it adds to overhead. So we've really taken that to heart. We've hired very senior, very capable people. Honestly, a big part of it is that I'm personally quite lazy when it comes to these things. And so hiring senior people means that I don't really have to manage things. I was on a podcast with Alex Lieberman, who started Morning Brew, and he asked how many direct reports I have. And I think it's like 20, but it's also kind of not 20 because like doing a quarterly check-in with somebody, does that count as managing them? It's like, not really. So because we have people who are so senior and capable of managing their own time, it can extend your capabilities. So in many ways, your role as CEO is to find those people. Somebody in leadership is somebody of whom you can delegate decision making to without looking over their shoulder. So getting to a point where you have as many of those people as possible. It's really the main goal of the job.
Awesome, Sam. Thanks so much. And then we have Leo. Do you want to come read the next question?
Yeah, absolutely. Sam, thanks so much for all the amazing insights. Here's a question that was asked by the community. Could you please outline your decision-making framework as a founder for difficult decisions?
Yeah. Um, it depends on what kind of difficult decision. Um, so one commonly used one is the Eisenhower matrix, if you're familiar with that. It's a very simple one of like how important is the thing versus how urgent it is. And almost everybody focuses their time on high urgency things that are not important because they're usually the easiest things to solve. It's like high urgency, not that important, but I can do it right now. And I can stop what I'm doing and I can get it solved. And it feels good to solve things. Um, the hardest things to do are the not urgent, high importance. Those ones almost never get done at companies, but they're usually the most important. And it's really easy to rationalize putting them off. Um, this is another thing where I've our teams is very good about this now. But it was challenging in the early days when like press opportunities would come about. And um, I know from experience that press is an amplifier. Press is not a growth lever. So um, most most companies spend most companies who pursue press will spend an inordinate amount of their time trying to trying to get more press and trying to do this sort of thing, but it's not a good use of resources. So um, we created some more specific criteria for when we would do a certain thing. Um, like one of the reasons why I looped in, I think I looped in Tom on the email here of uh, for whether I should do this conversation. And we have some criteria, which is one, it has to be recorded so that it's in the form of content. It has to be distributed in some capacity. And there are some criteria that we have to just make sure that it's good use of time. So uh, I think that in terms of how to make important decisions, I found that writing out long form documents and really clarifying your thoughts on why you make certain decisions. And also because it's in documentation form, distributing that to the rest of the team so that everyone else knows how decisions are made in the company really helps a lot. So um, some of these things are it also helps to ask third parties for specifically hard decisions. Like there have been some people we had to let go at the company, which were not comfortable. That's probably my least favorite part of the job is I I much prefer dealing with computers. So figuring out like people stuff is the least fun part of my job, but it is necessary. So sometimes just talking to a third party who you know is very experienced with this stuff, and sometimes the results you get back are kind of mixed, and that's okay. You have to figure it out. Other times, which has been the case for us, other times like every single person gave the same answer. I was like, "What are you doing? You know what the right answer is here. You're just being a coward." It's like, okay, all right, fair enough. All right, I know what I need to do, and so that just gives the motivation to make the right decision. It's like the role of the CEO. CEO definitionally is the ultimate decision maker in the company. You know, the final decision in the company. It's just the dictionary definition. So uh, making good decisions, it's it's not going to be easy for me to explain it other than to say like read lots of books, make lots of bad decisions and try to learn from them. um, so I think most of the time the failure modes that I've seen in people is in and certainly my own failure modes is prioritizing the wrong things. So focusing too much on things that feel urgent right now. And not blocking off the time to really do the uncomfortable thing, which is to solve the hard problems that are not urgent.
Thanks, Sam. And as you know, most of us are from Latin America or building something for the region. So the next question is the community wants to know when is levels going to be available in Latam? And maybe on that, tell us a little bit about your growth plans.
Yeah, hopefully as soon as possible. This is unfortunately all just contractual, working with large medical device manufacturers, and they work at a different speed than we do. But we hired Karen, she's leading international expansion for us, and so she's been working. I think we had a call with one of the manufacturers yesterday about this. So hopefully very soon, but it's largely out of our control, unfortunately. I think maybe this year.
Awesome. And then I'm going to call out Jessica if you want to come and read the next question.
Of course. Hi, Sam. This is also a question from the community, and you have touched upon a lot, I think, but here it goes. There is a big myth that you cannot succeed as CEO without overworking yourself. So what is your advice for first-time founder, especially on how to avoid burnout?
Yeah, it's I think that burnout is something that is self-imposed, generally speaking. So I think that it's probably unlikely that, especially first-time founders, can be successful without working more hours than like 40 hours a week. I can't think of an example of a CEO, say under the age of 30, who was successful while working normal hours. But that doesn't mean that's not the same thing as burnout. Like I work 80 to 100 hours a week, and it really doesn't feel like work to me. It's I don't do things that I don't want to do. It's just one of my philosophies, and it kind of permeates the entire organization, where we regularly have people audit what they're spending their time on. And if we hired you as an engineer and you're focused on back end, but you don't want to do that anymore, then fine, let's find something else for you to do. People shouldn't have to do things they don't want to do. And so this was a really interesting learning that I had from, this was, I think 9 years ago now. I read 4 Hour Workweek by Tim Ferriss. And one of the things that he mentions in the book is how important, he says that delegating is really important. And it's not something that you just know how to do. Delegating takes practice. And so I went on to Craigslist and I posted asking for an executive assistant. I didn't have anything for her to do. So I just hired her with no tasks for her to do. And I gave myself the challenge of finding something to delegate. And it was pretty hard. And I had to come up with ways to task her with things. And through the process, I would ask her to do something, and then she would respond with a bunch of questions. And I would realize, oh, I didn't give her enough context to be successful here. And so over the course of the last 9 years, I've gotten pretty good at delegating. And so one of the big learnings from that experience was how there's an expression, different strokes for different folks, which is that like some people like some things, other people like other things, and that's fine. And Lori, who's been my EA for 9 years now, she things that would drive me crazy are things like wrapping Christmas presents. I would lose my mind if I have to do that. And she loves doing it. And so when it comes like Christmas season, or even not Christmas season, this happens throughout the year, I'll come across something and I'll say, hey, Lori, can you get this for my brother for Christmas? And she'll order it in March. She'll wrap it and she'll ship it to him for Christmas. So I don't have to think about it. And she loves doing that. And there's no judgment in any of this stuff. Different people like different things. I've just recognized in myself that I'm relentlessly novelty seeking. And if I'm working on the same problem for more than a couple of weeks, I go crazy. So other people love solving certain types of problems, and just finding the right people to solve the right problems, and not trying to force people to do things they don't want to do. Like you're setting yourself up for trouble. So I've been working this number of hours since, I don't know, as long as I can remember. And I would not say I've even come close to burnout. And when I was doing programming, I loved programming. It was what I would do in my free time on weekends. And like people would say that I work too much. It's like, okay, you can go skiing if you want. I would rather do this. So like I don't appreciate I like the I would tell people like their judgment of how I'm spending my time is like, just because you hate programming doesn't mean that I shouldn't be doing it. Like we have different preferences, so it should be okay. So anyway, I think that the most important thing is to just know what it is you want to do so that work doesn't feel like work. And that that makes it a lot easier to get through and not get close to burnout.
Thanks so much, Sam. And we have Alex Sosa.
Thank you. Hey, Sam. So my question is, what are your daily non-negotiable rituals or activities that you do? Whatever happens.
Hmm. I don't think I have any daily ones. Um, I've been largely, I guess, what is now called a digital nomad for probably the last 8 years, maybe 9 years. And I don't really, I found that I can work from pretty much anywhere. I'm currently sitting on a couch doing this call. And I could be at a desk, I could be at a coffee shop. I'm pretty flexible in how I do things. I like to go on walks and listen to audiobooks. Um, I think maybe this is less of a specific routine. I would say the non-negotiables for me are around how I structure my time. So like if I block off a day for deep work, it is, and somebody wants to schedule a meeting on that day, that's non-negotiable. Like, no, this day is sacred. You're not touching my deep work days. And I I try to and another interesting data point is I currently have 5 EAs working for me, not including Lori, so I guess 6. The 5 are in the Philippines, and they do a lot of my recurring tasks. So things like posting somewhere, some piece of information, updating stuff. They schedule like day before emails so that people have context coming into calls. They add Notion docs so that I'm ready for stuff. I have yet to communicate with any of them synchronously on a call. We do all of it asynchronously, email or via Loom. All of the instructions are done asynchronously, because these meetings are anti-work. And so when I think about things that are non-negotiable, I would say it's minimizing the number of meetings that I have in my life is probably my non-negotiable.
Thanks so much, Alex, for your question, and Sam. And we have Jaime Rojas. Come up.
Hi, Sam. How are you? So, my question is, drive people up level by a common purpose? And if you do it, how do you do it?
Do I do what?
How do you drive people by a common purpose?
Yeah, I think some of it is, this is a something that I think we do quite well is we have our Friday forums, which is our weekly team all hands where we celebrate these successes for the week. And this was a mistake that we had at Cardash where we didn't do it. We just sort of assumed that everyone would know what was going on, and the morale was quite low. And so like it's an interesting data point from our side is that our Friday forums are optional. Like the Friday forum is actually happening right now, and it's recorded and distributed. So I'm just going to watch the recording, but it's totally optional, and almost all of the company goes every week. So when you have an optional meeting in a culture of no meetings and people opt into a meeting, it's usually an indication that people really get value from it. This is, I think that having that culture of documentation and strong communication is important. I do think that there's something about being able to make assumptions about the people that that you work at. The uh, if you can't assume that people are motivated, then you need to solve your upstream hiring process. Um, we because we're fully remote, we have been since day one. Um, we we don't even have the ability to look over people's shoulders, even if we wanted to. We don't. There's no. There isn't a fiber of our being that has the co-located office environment. There are. Somebody was telling me about a consulting firm, one of the big consulting firms that they add weight measurements to their chairs so they can measure how much time the person who works there spent in their chair. Yeah, and like I if you have that kind of culture, I can see why that would be useful. But we're like so far in the opposite direction that we do as much as we can to make sure that people understand the vision and they feel like we're making progress towards that vision. But like intrinsic motivation is something that we filter for very early on. So if people aren't, it's one of our core guiding principles is to treat people like adults. And like it's not our job to solve for intrinsic motivation. Um, and so I think we do as much as we can in the form of content. Maybe that's like the meta answer to your question is we try to produce as much content as we can internally. But at the end of the day, if somebody is not motivated, that's nothing we can do about it, and they should probably leave.
Thanks, Sam. There was a running joke on the chat. Well, two actually. Gina apparently is applying for a job at Level. And Ando, do you want to translate what you just said? Because it's hilarious.
Well, yeah, in most countries of Latin America, what you just said of waiting like the chairs, so to measure the hours that people spend sitting, we call that in Mexico horas nalga, which means like butt hours that you spend sitting on your chair. Yeah.
Yeah, there's the culture is it's often called like a butts and seats culture, where it's just like put people. It's like the classic. It's like if you've ever seen the movie Office Space, where you have people sitting in seats, and then you have the managers who just like walk around like hawks, making sure that people are on task. And like you can have that kind of culture, and maybe that works if you work with a different category of people. But when you're hiring very capable, we hire mostly very senior people. It's kind of condescending to do that. So it's condescending and not very effective. So it's not worth it.
Great, thank you. And we have Guta, if you want to come up and ask your question.
Hey, hi Sam, loving it. I asked about culture. You sound like someone that cares a lot about culture. So how do you build it? Or what are the rituals and tools that you use? We are fully remote over here as well.
Yeah, I think it's worth. I've been thinking a lot about this recently on what is culture. Like complete coincidence, we released a podcast on some of this yesterday on a whole new level, where I had a conversation with my co-founder Josh and our editorial director Mike Heaney on one of these topics. But culture means a lot of different things to different people, and I think that what culture means to me is culture is the set of assumptions that you can make about other people in your company without having ever interacted with them. So like you can assume when you interact with somebody at Levels and you say like, hey, let's get on a call, you can assume that they're going to respond with, hey, can we not do a call? Can you just send it to me by email? Because nobody at Levels wants to do meetings. And we do as many things asynchronously as possible until until that medium breaks, and then we'll get on a call if absolutely necessary. It turns out it's almost never necessary, but the working with somebody at levels, you can assume that everyone at levels assumes good faith. This is something that we've seen. Everyone at levels is on board with things like treat people like adults, which is something that we mean it when we say it. Like when we don't build policies assuming the worst in people. We think, how would an adult react to the situation? And then we just build the policy for that. I think that a lot of people, when they think about building culture, they're often hedging for the worst case scenario. And you're building a policy around like, well, what if somebody abuses this? Like what you should start with is assume people won't abuse it. Now what? Like if they abuse it, fire them from the company. Like problem solved. Don't have people who would act like this. So it reminds me of I was a consultant at a company helping them with software stuff, and it was a relatively small company, but they had one guy who every week or so would make just a wildly inappropriate comment about women to everyone in the office. And like the next day, the whole company would get an email reminding us of like, oh, we just updated our policy that, no condescending comments about genders. It's like, it's just him. It's like, just somebody tell him. Like, why are we adding policies? Just tell him. So that's where the policies don't solve anything if you have people who don't follow the policies. So in many ways, building culture is around selecting the right people, setting clear expectations very early in the kind of culture that you build. In the conversations that I have, I do a culture fit call with everybody before we make them an offer. And honest to God, I spend the entire 30 minutes trying to convince them they don't want to join. I tell them all of the reasons why people have opted out of the process, why the culture that we're building is not for everybody, why, like, I'll tell people that we're fully remote, which means if you're looking to make a new group of best friends, it's probably not going to happen because like you don't have these casual social interactions. You're going to like the people you work with, but it's not the same. So that's what I think of when I think about culture. It's getting people to commit to a set of principles and shared values and doing that as early as possible. But also setting the expectation that culture changes over time and not everybody is going to be able to adapt to it. So over time, you might have to ask people to leave the company because they're no longer on the same page in terms of the culture that you're building.
Awesome. Thanks, Sam. And we have we're going to try to make 3 more questions. Let's see. But these ones are kind of short and sweet. Mateo, if you're here.
Hey, Sam. I wanted to ask you when you're fully remote, it's even more important to be more aligned. What kind of frameworks do you use to align people and besides what you are already doing in a asynchronous way of working?
Yeah, I think lots and lots and lots of content.
Okay.
Specifically, in fact, I think I have a snippet for this.
And so you kind of produce the content and then distribute it to the team, or the only meeting that you have is this Friday you form, but besides that, you avoid meetings.
Yeah, pretty much. Like I'll post in the chat here. I have a snippet just because I often send these links to people. Copy, paste. I can't seem to paste them in the chat, but I'll send some examples here. Is it working? Here's one. I'll send these as a follow-up afterwards, but I've probably written most of these, but over time, more people in leadership are taking on these memos. What's interesting is that I have personally been criticized by people who see all of our memos and all of our long form thoughts, and they criticize us for spending too much time on documentation, which is completely wrong, by the way. Because when I actually quantify it, I've written 3/4 of all of the memos in the company at this point, and it's about 4% of my time went into writing these things, which means that most people are spending basically 0%, a rounding error of time writing up documentation to think through ideas and to share context with the team. So I think getting alignment in like depth of thought, and some of these documents that I'll share with you, like we have 2 documents on just alignment around communication. We have an entire document on principles of decision making, on how decisions are made within the company. So I'll send some of these as a follow if you want, but the making sure that everyone understands how decisions are made, it increases their confidence in why the company operates the way that it does. It's also a great opt-out for people who are not on board with these things. If the company culture has adapted in a way that they're no longer comfortable with, then that's a conversation. And it's not a failure if somebody who started on day 1, after 2 years, you're basically a different company. If you're a rapidly growing startup, you're a different company every 6 to 12 months. So it's not a failure that they were the right person for the first 2 years and they're not the right person anymore. That's okay. And so I think it's important to keep in mind that companies, it's a team, not a family. You're here to solve a problem. You don't owe unconditional love to somebody for the rest of their life in the context of a company, which for some people sounds uncomfortable, but it's also kind of obviously true. Like a family dynamic should be different than a work dynamic, because it can lead to these weird pathological tendencies as well if you think about it the wrong way.
Sam, if I can follow up on that, have you seen that, for example, articles or writing works more than video, for example, for placing that context?
Yeah, we do a little bit of both. I think that writing does a really good job only because the density of information is much higher. We do a lot of video as well. And I'd say most of our strategy documents also have like a 10-minute summary video as well, that we just do with Loom. But the density of information in writing is much higher, and it allows you to quickly skim through it and get the information in a way that's more scalable. So each medium has its trade-offs. So we do it. I think the answer is yes, and you just do both.
Okay. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks. And we have Adriana up next.
Yes, thank you, Sam. So how do you pick the books you read?
Oh, I have a long list of books. I do most of them as audiobooks. I have a wish list. When people recommend books to me, I'll just add it to my wish list. And then something that I found really helped increase my reading cadence is, this was like 8 years ago. I decided that, I'm at goodreads.com/Sam Corcos. There it is. I made the decision not to, I will only buy a book if it's the next book I'm going to read. And what I found is what I had been doing historically is I would buy books optimistically, like, oh, I should read this book. And then I just don't have the motivation to actually read it. And so I would read far fewer books than I would want. So when I finish a book, I would go through my wish list and then just start looking through, what do I actually feel like reading right now? And it's like, you know what? I feel like reading a book on complexity theory. That sounds so interesting. And I'm just going to read that, or a biography or whatever. I'm not going to try to force myself to read things that I don't want to read. So that's been a huge win for me, is just not trying to force myself to do things that I don't want to do.